Welcome back to our channel. Hope you all are fine. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's begin with another day of aviation. Miracle! The flight had begun like countless others. Calm, steady, predictable. The cabin lights glowed with a gentle warmth, casting soft reflections on the overhead bins. Passengers eased into their seats, some closing their eyes, some flipping through magazines, and some simply listening to the gentle hum of the engines. Nothing hinted at what would happen later. Nothing warned of the moment when the entire aircraft would be left without a pilot. At 32,000 feet, the world outside the windows looked peaceful, an endless stretch of silver clouds blanketing the darkness below. Inside the cabin, the light turbulence felt routine, something the flight attendant, Aria Hayes, had experienced for years. Her movements were steady, precise, the signs of someone who had memorized every aisle, every seat number, every emergency procedure. Her calm presence reassured people without her even trying. She had completed the usual safety checks and was preparing for the first walk of the flight when a faint vibration ran through the floor beneath her. It wasn't unusual, yet something about it felt different, sharper, more abrupt, like the plane had swallowed a sudden gust of wind it wasn't prepared for. She glanced toward the front of the aircraft automatically, her instincts always tuned to the cockpit, but saw nothing out of place. The cockpit door remained closed, the panel lights above it glowing softly. The seconds ticked into minutes. The turbulence smoothed out. The passengers settled. Yet that strange vibration lingered in her memory, brewing a quiet unease she couldn't quite shake. As she moved up the aisle, she kept glancing toward the nose of the plane, waiting for the usual sound, a small chime from the cockpit, indicating everything was normal. But the chime never came. Instead, a single irregular tremor rippled through the fuselage, more forceful than before. A couple of passengers looked up, confused but calm. Aria steadied herself against a seat and waited. The engines continued their steady drone. Nothing else seemed wrong. Still, something was. Aria approached the forward galley, intending to check the cockpit through the peephole. But before she reached it, a soft thud echoed from behind the reinforced door, so small that no one else seemed to hear it, so faint it could have been metal shifting, or luggage shifting, or simply her imagination. But her instincts froze her in place. She listened. Silence. A silence too heavy for an aircraft mid-flight. The cockpit always carried sound, switch clicks, faint radio chatter, quiet mechanical movements, but now it felt like a void, like the heart of the plane had stopped beating. A chill tightened down her spine. She pressed her hand gently against the cold metal of the door. No movement, no shadow, no sound. Her training began to push through her rising panic. She triggered the emergency cockpit signal, the one that always prompted an immediate response, a signal that required action from the crew inside within seconds. She waited. Seconds passed. No response. A deeper fear settled in her chest. Not a sudden, frantic fear, but a cold, expanding weight that made her breath shorter, her movements slower. She tried again. Second. Signal. Stronger. Clear. Impossible for the pilots to miss. Still nothing. She felt the aircraft shift slightly, but it wasn't banked. Wasn't descending, it was simply on autopilot, following its planned route without human hands guiding it. Autopilot was safe, she reminded herself. Autopilot kept planes stable. Autopilot didn't panic. But autopilot couldn't land a plane with 230 lives on board. And it certainly couldn't handle emergencies. She braced herself, keyed in the emergency override code, and unlocked the cockpit. The door clicked open with a weighted slowness, like it had something to hide. The moment she stepped inside, the world changed. The glowing lights of the cockpit panels cast a dim red and amber glow, the screens shimmering with data and altitudes. Everything looked normal, everything except the two figures in the seats. Both pilots were slumped forward, motionless, their hands limp, their breathing shallow and uneven. The captain's head rested against his chest, the co-pilot leaning sideways against the seat's side support. The oxygen masks hung above them, unused. Aria felt her heart hammering against her ribs, the air crushing her lungs. But panic could not take root. Not now, not here. She forced herself to check for any signs of consciousness. A pulse, movement, anything. Both men were alive, but neither could respond. The small medical pack in the cockpit gave her little Information, blood pressure low, breathing irregular, something systemic rather than mechanical. Behind her, the cockpit door remained open, but the world outside felt a million miles away. The passengers had no idea that the people responsible for guiding this machine through the sky were gone. 230 people, one flight attendant, no pilots, no commands, no guidance, just the quiet hum of an aircraft suspended between fate and survival. She took a breath, a long, deliberate breath that steadied the trembling in her hands. She slowly settled into the captain's seat, something she had never imagined doing in her life. She looked at the massive array of controls that she had only ever seen from a distance. Watching pilots do their job didn't prepare her for the overwhelming complexity of being the one sitting in the seat. But autopilot was stable. The aircraft wasn't descending. The engines weren't failing. She had time, but not enough. She needed help. She reached for the radio, scanning her memory for every training session, every emergency procedure she had been taught. The cabin was calm. The flight was steady. No one knew. She inhaled again. Her fingers hovered over the controls. She could feel the weight of every life behind her, unaware that their fate now lay with someone who had never touched a yoke before today. The sky outside glowed with a shifting silver light as the aircraft continued smoothly onward, an illusion of peace hiding the truth. 2 pilots down, 1 flight attendant alone, 32,000 feet above the earth, and nowhere to turn but forward. The cockpit was alive with lights, alarms, and blinking indicators, yet completely silent in terms of human response. Aria Hayes, the flight attendant, had never imagined she would be sitting in the captain's seat, hands trembling slightly as she tried to make sense of the array of switches, dials, and gauges in front of her. Each screen told a different story. Altitude, airspeed, fuel levels, autopilot status. The autopilot was stable, but it could only maintain altitude and heading. It could not land the aircraft, and it certainly could not respond to emergencies. Outside, clouds stretched endlessly. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and gray. The airplane followed its autopilot path, cutting through the heavens at 32,000 feet, oblivious to the crisis within. Every passenger remained unaware of the nightmare taking place just meters ahead. They smiled, read, dozed, and sipped beverages, while one woman held the future of 230 lives in her hands. Aria's mind raced. She had been trained in emergency procedures, in evacuations, in first aid, but never in actually flying a plane. Yet here she was, scanning the cockpit instruments, absorbing as much information as she could, knowing that hesitation could cost lives. She reminded herself of the basics she had learned. Maintain control, monitor instruments, communicate. The radios were functional. She could call for assistance. Her hands hovered over the controls, fingers brushing the yoke in a careful, experimental way. A small tremor ran through her, but she forced herself to focus. The autopilot maintained altitude, but the aircraft's heading showed a slight drift. Aria corrected it using small, calculated adjustments. Every movement was deliberate. Every second mattered. The cabin remained calm, almost unnaturally so. Some passengers noticed the subtle rocking of the plane, but most assumed it was normal turbulence. Flight attendants moved along the aisles, but even they sensed something was off. Their glances toward the cockpit were loaded with uncertainty, though none dared enter to check. Aria was alone in understanding the true scale of the emergency. She activated the radio. Her voice, steady despite the pounding of her heart, transmitted a call to the nearest air traffic control center. Mayday, Mayday, Flight 782, pilots incapacitated. Request immediate assistance. She repeated it, twice, thrice, until a calm but urgent voice responded. Controllers acknowledged her situation and began issuing instructions, walking her through procedures with precise, measured words. Step by step, she followed their guidance. Altitude adjustments, heading corrections, minor throttle adjustments. Every action required intense focus, mental calculations, and careful observation. Outside, clouds rolled beneath the plane like an endless ocean, oblivious to the peril inside the cockpit. Fuel levels ticked downward. Time was not on her side. Controllers advised slowing slightly to conserve fuel, and Aria carefully adjusted the throttle, feeling the plane respond beneath her hands. Every input had to be perfect. Too much, and the aircraft could stall, Too little, and they could overshoot or descend too rapidly. She practiced small maneuvers first, correcting the plane's drift, maintaining level flight. Each successful adjustment built a fraction of confidence. Though fear remained close, a shadow at her shoulder. The screens continued to flash data, warnings, systems checks, minor alerts. She ignored minor alarms that were non-critical, focusing on the essentials: altitude, heading, fuel, airspeed. The sun dipped further, casting shadows into the cockpit. The horizon blurred into muted gray. Outside, the controllers guided her toward a holding pattern over a nearby airport, giving her time to stabilize and prepare for an emergency landing. Aria calculated mentally approach patterns: glide slope, wind speed, runway length. The thought of actually touching the runway made her stomach tighten. The plane was too large, too fast, too heavy. She ran through the emergency landing checklist in her head. The flaps, the landing gear, the brakes. Every variable mattered. She had never physically engaged the landing gear. She only knew what the cockpit manuals had shown her, yet the aircraft needed her to act soon. Back in the cabin, subtle tension began to ripple through the passengers. The plane had been circling for several minutes longer than expected. Some glanced out the windows at the lights below. Some murmured in confusion, feeling the unusual pattern in the air. Flight attendants tried to maintain calm, masking their own rising concern. Aria could feel her pulse in her temples. She adjusted the controls slightly, bringing the aircraft closer to the intended holding position. She monitored her instruments like a hawk. Any deviation could spell disaster. Controllers continued to speak over the radio, giving her minor course corrections. Their voices were calm, guiding, yet their words carried the gravity of the situation. A sudden vibration jolted the plane, a minor mechanical alert. Aria scanned the instruments. Nothing critical. She exhaled slowly, forcing her body to relax. She needed to maintain her focus. Every movement was deliberate, every thought controlled. Panic could lead to catastrophe. Minutes stretched endlessly. The aircraft glided through clouds, steady but tense. Aria's training in emergency response and first aid had never prepared her for piloting, yet she adapted. She watched, adjusted, calculated, and recalculated. Each action a step closer to safety. She practiced small altitude adjustments, preparing mentally for descent. She visualized the runway below, imagining the approach path. Every simulation she had ever run in emergency drills now guided her. She ran through all potential emergencies in her head: engine failure, turbulence, sudden mechanical alert. Each scenario strengthened her. Resolve. The horizon darkened, further as night began to fall. Below, city lights twinkled like distant stars. Controllers guided her closer to the airport, aligning the aircraft with the holding pattern for a future emergency landing. Her hands gripped the yoke tightly. The plane responded obediently, gliding through the air with a mixture of mechanical precision and her careful guidance. And then she saw the first glimpse of the runway ahead, lights stretching across the tarmac. Foam trucks lined up, emergency crews in position. She inhaled deeply. This was it, the moment she had been training for in her mind, the moment where thousands of mental calculations and every ounce of composure would be tested. The aircraft was stable, autopilot maintaining some systems, but she knew it would be up to her to bring it safely down. Her heart raced, but her hands remained steady. The first part of the journey, maintaining control, stabilizing the plane, communicating with controllers, was complete. The next part, the landing, would be far more difficult, far more dangerous. 230 lives depended on her. Aria Hayes, flight attendant, had become the unlikeliest hero at 32,000 feet. The cabin lights glowed dimly as the plane continued its long, silent glide toward the distant runway. Outside, clouds drifted past the windows in endless, muted grays, catching the occasional moonlight that spilled across the fuselage. Inside the cockpit, Aria Hayes' hands gripped the controls with a trembling precision. Her eyes locked on the instrument panels that seemed to glow brighter with every second. The autopilot maintained altitude, but it could not account for variables like the wind shear ahead, sudden turbulence, or mechanical irregularities in the landing gear. Each gauge flickered under the strain, flashing warnings that demanded careful attention. Every second that passed, she felt the weight of 230 lives pressing into her chest. A force stronger than gravity itself. She adjusted the throttle slightly, coaxing the aircraft to slow without losing lift. Her eyes darted between the horizon, the instruments, and the distant runway lights growing brighter. Controllers guided her through a wide holding pattern to line up for approach, repeating every instruction carefully, their voices calm but urgent. Each word was a lifeline, every instruction a bridge between survival and disaster. Her mind worked in a blur. Every check she had ever learned, every simulation she had ever seen, every drill from emergency training merged into a single focus. Keep the aircraft steady, keep the passengers safe, get them to the ground. She glanced at the pilots slumped in their seats behind her, a silent reminder of the stakes. Their absence made her acutely aware of the void she was filling. The cabin trembled as the plane encountered a pocket of turbulence. Drinks rattled on trays, a few passengers gasped, and overhead bins rattled. Flight attendants moved carefully down the aisles, securing loose items, their faces taut with tension but masking their own fear. Every movement in the cabin reminded Arya of what could happen if the plane became unstable. She had to maintain absolute control. She checked the landing gear indicators. All appeared normal. Yet she knew that real-life mechanical issues could lurk behind perfect readings. One misstep, one uneven adjustment, and the plane could tilt dangerously. She mentally rehearsed emergency procedures for gear failure, recalling every detail she had ever read. This was no longer theory, it was reality, and theory would not save them. The city lights below were beginning to grow clearer as the plane descended gradually. The runway ahead was alive with emergency crews. Foam trucks lined up in preparation, and the controllers' voices echoed through the headset with precise, calm directions. The runway would not forgive mistakes. Precision was everything. Arya adjusted flaps and rudder slightly, feeling the subtle changes in the aircraft's behavior. The plane was obedient but sensitive. She reminded herself to trust her instincts, to remain calm, to keep her actions deliberate. Each minor correction reduced the risk of catastrophe. She could feel the tension vibrating through the controls, through the yoke, through her own body. Suddenly, a warning light flickered, small but insistent. She leaned forward, scanning every gauge, every panel, every blinking light. Nothing critical yet, but enough to jolt her heart. She remembered the training. Ignore minor false warnings if the critical path is stable. Her fingers tightened around the controls, making subtle adjustments to maintain steady glide. In the cabin, passengers began noticing subtle changes in the plane's movement. Some shifted uneasily, gripping armrests, eyes wide, realizing that this was no ordinary flight. Flight attendants remained calm, reassuring, though their movements betrayed the tension in their bodies. Every face in the cabin reflected an unspoken fear. The plane had a passenger they could not see, the invisible fear of uncertainty. Arya's eyes returned to the runway. The lights were now visible in detail, stretching across the tarmac like a promise of safety. She mentally mapped the descent path, calculating altitude, speed, and approach angle. Every variable mattered. She adjusted the throttle incrementally, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The plane tilted slightly as a mild crosswind buffeted the fuselage. She compensated with subtle inputs on the yoke, gently nudging the aircraft back on course. Each correction required patience and focus. She could feel the weight of the plane responding, heavy yet delicate. Every millimeter of misalignment could be catastrophic, but each successful adjustment built a fragile thread of confidence. Below, the runway crews remained vigilant. Firefighters readied hoses, foam trucks were primed, and medics prepared for the worst. The scene was tense, almost cinematic in its anticipation. Every person on the ground understood the stakes, and yet they were helpless, completely dependent on the young flight attendant in the cockpit. The descent continued. The autopilot remained partially engaged, but Arya knew that the final approach, the actual landing, would require her full attention. She practiced minor turns, gently reducing speed, checking instrument readings. The aircraft was stable but fragile, balanced on a knife edge between calm and chaos. A slight jolt from a small air pocket reminded her that the sky itself could betray her. She adjusted thrust, countered the turbulence, and maintained altitude. Each second stretched endlessly. The city lights below reflected on the fuselage, the runway lights approaching slowly like a distant dream. Her mind briefly registered fear, but she forced it away. Panic could not guide her. Skill, focus, and courage would. Each breath she took was controlled, measured, each movement deliberate. The weight of 230 lives pressed on her shoulders, a tangible force she could neither ignore nor relinquish. The aircraft began its final alignment with the runway. The controller's calm instructions cut through the tension, guiding her descent in minute increments. Every gauge reading mattered. Every light was monitored. Every twitch of the controls analyzed. She had come this far. Now there was no turning back. The runway stretched ahead, a lifeline of light and safety. The plane responded to her inputs with careful precision, yet she knew that the true challenge was only beginning. The landing, the moment when everything would depend on her ability to remain calm under unimaginable pressure. Arya took a deep breath, inhaling courage as if it were air itself. She prepared for the final descent. Every ounce of focus, every memory of training, every instinct she had cultivated would now be tested against the laws of physics, gravity, and fate. The first stage of survival, taking control, was complete. The next stage would determine whether 230 lives would touch the ground safely or descend into disaster. The final moments approached with a weight that felt heavier than the airplane itself. Every passenger on board sat frozen in silence, their breaths trapped inside tense chests as the aircraft lowered toward the runway lights below. The woman who was never trained to fly a plane, the flight attendant who had stepped into the cockpit when both pilots collapsed, now guided 230 souls into the most critical seconds of their lives. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming responsibility that had been forced onto her shoulders. She had memorized every instruction the distant controller had fed her moments. A go, pitch, speed, alignment. Now those words felt like ghostly echoes in her mind as the runway stretched out like a narrow ribbon of light beneath. A roaring sky. A gust of wind slapped the aircraft. The nose shifted. A warning beep screamed again. The jet wobbled, the wings trembling under the sudden turbulence. The aircraft wasn't just landing. It was fighting the sky itself. She tightened both hands on the controls. The descent rate steadied. Altitude dropped rapidly. The engines howled against gravity, pushing, pulling, fighting to keep the aircraft stable. In the cabin, a small girl clutched her mother's sleeve. A man closed his eyes, silently preparing for whatever fate had written for him. A flight attendant, her colleague, leaned against a seat for balance as the aircraft dipped. They all knew something unnatural was happening behind the cockpit door, but they trusted the unseen hands fighting for their survival. The ground rushed closer. The lights grew bigger. The speed still felt impossibly high. She had seconds left. The plane aligned with the runway, but slightly off-center. A normal landing could no longer be expected. This was a controlled fall, a desperate attempt to keep the nose level and the wheels straight. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. The yoke felt heavier than steel. Altitude dropping. Speed still too high. She eased the throttle as she had been instructed. The engines roared softer, their power retreating. The aircraft floated, almost weightless, suspended in a fragile balance between sky and earth. Then, the first wheel touched down. A jolt shook the cabin. Overhead bins rattled viciously. A second wheel slammed the runway. Sparks shot from one side as rubber met asphalt with bone-rattling force. The aircraft bounced, hard. For a terrifying moment, it lifted again, as if refusing the Earth's grip. She pulled the controls gently, trying not to overcorrect. The jet, despite its weight and momentum, responded like a wounded giant. Then it dropped again, heavy, violent, but on all wheels this time. Screech, sparks, smoke. The runway rushed beneath them like a blur of concrete and fire. She pressed the brakes, her arms straining as the engines reversed with a deafening roar. The plane fought, skidding slightly left, tires scraping under maximum pressure. The end of the runway neared, a line of fire trucks glowing red beyond the haze. The aircraft slowed. Slowed more. Slowed. Until the roaring fell into a soft rumble. The plane came to a full stop. For a moment, nothing happened. Silence engulfed everything, a stunned, disbelieving silence. Then the cabin erupted. Passengers sobbed, hands shaking, lungs releasing breaths they didn't know they'd been holding. Some covered their faces. Others stared at the ceiling, unable to process the miracle they had just survived. Inside the cockpit, She let go of the yoke for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Her hands left sweaty imprints on the controls. Her arms gave out, dropping to her sides as her chest rose and fell with relief so intense it almost hurt. She wasn't a pilot. She wasn't trained for this. She was just a flight attendant who refused to let fear write the ending of this story. Footsteps rushed toward the cockpit door as ground crew climbed aboard. When it opened, they stood frozen, staring at the young woman sitting alone in the captain's seat. Aviation teams had prepared for a disaster, a fireball, a tragedy. Instead, they found a quiet, trembling hero. Later, as passengers stepped off the aircraft, many paused at the cockpit door. Some pressed hands over their hearts. Others nodded through tear-filled eyes. They didn't know her name, but they knew one truth. She saved them, all 230 of them. Hours later, long after emergency lights faded and the aircraft sat silent on the runway, investigators quietly reviewed the cockpit footage. They watched her steady hands, her controlled breathing, her courage in the face of absolute terror. A civilian with no training had pulled off a landing. Most pilots never face in their entire careers, and for one reason only, she refused to abandon hope. That night, while the world slept, one story traveled across continents faster than any plane could fly. A flight attendant had saved 230 lives, because in the darkest moment of the sky, she became the light.